Alright, what's up everybody? So today I'm going to be responding to Natural Hypertrophy's video from the other day where he was critiquing tier lists as a concept, and I think he had a lot of value in that video, so if you haven't seen it yet I would recommend checking it out. And basically his case was that tier lists are almost a little bit pointless if we're not sure what the criteria even is for those tier lists. So he wants to promote each person on YouTube that creates content to let you guys know what our criteria is and what makes a good lift based on that criteria and see if that resonates with you guys. All right. Hello? Yeah, I'm filming video. Why? Who's this? Oh. Yeah, hey Mr. President. Oh, yeah, hey Mr. Trump. Yeah. I didn't know you guys were like friends behind the scenes. That's interesting. Yeah, what's up? How would I know what group of people struggles the most in America? I'm a fitness YouTuber. Why are you calling me? What would I know about that? I don't know. I guess I just have to guess. Okay, so you did a poll and a study? Interesting. Yeah, what are the results? Oh. Yeah, I did not expect that. Huh. So you're saying the race that struggles most in America is power builders? Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I can release it today if you want me to make some content on it. I wouldn't be able to like help you guys, but I can talk about it on my channel, but I'm not gonna like leave YouTube to like work for the government. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean these 10 criteria to help them pick better lifts would be a start. I mean, yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah. I'll make the video. I'll talk to you guys later. All right. Yep. Bye, guys. Alright, so my camera battery died, so gonna restart the video real quick, but basically I want to talk about my own 10 pieces of criteria for what makes a good lift, and you guys are kind of already familiar with some of them from the tier lists that I've already made. Of course, I've made a few of my own. I've responded to most of Jeff Nippert's tier lists, and usually what I talk about is resistance profiles and overall stability. I've talked about if it feels good or not, mostly in response to what Jeff is saying, but either way, before getting into all of that, let's run through the list that I have of 10 pieces of criteria that I believe to be the most important when choosing a lift for hypertrophy and when ranking them as a whole in a tier list. So I'm just gonna list the 10 first. This is not in order. It is completely out of order, so don't read into it. I'm gonna go through the order and rank them from least important to most important after I list them, and I'm going to talk about why, just as Natural Hypertrophy did in his video. So the 10 that I have, number 1 is stability. So how stable is that lift? It's a little bit more nuanced than just how stable it is, but general stability is what I'm referencing here. The resistance profile or the strength curve, so how heavy or light does the movement get at certain points of the movement based on your own internal strength curve and based on the physics of the movement itself. Whether the movement allows for your desired level of strictness or cheat. I think that's kind of an overlooked and important variable. If something is, say, super short biased and it allows for no cheat at all, maybe not the best lift. And if something is, if you want something to be super strict but it allows for a ton of cheat and kind of encourages technique deviation, maybe not the ideal lift for hypertrophy, like barbell squats, for example, but more on that later. Progression potential. How much are you incentivized to change your technique to add load over time versus how easy is it to consistently keep your technique the same as you progress on that lift? Technicality and room for technique deviation. How technical is that lift? How hard is it to learn? If a lift is very, very hard to learn, or it gets very, very hard as you approach failure, that can be something that can knock it down a little bit. So I'm not going to give my rank for pull-ups right now, but pull-ups are just a good example of a lift that gets very difficult to maintain your good technique as you approach failure. The next one I have is enjoyment. So how much do you enjoy a lift? Yeah, sneak peek, that is in the top 10. Next one, does it feel good? Does it not hurt? And that's not the flashiest pick or anything, but it is, of course, going to be valuable because if a lift does hurt, yeah, it's not going to be the best for you, but of course it does depend on how much it hurts and what type of hurt that is. Is it complementary to your program? So within the context of the program that you are running, does this lift make sense based on what else is in it? Total muscle group stimulated. So this is where something like maybe a low bar squat could gain points because it trains your spinal erectors, trains your quads and your glutes, versus just a leg extension, it only trains your quads. Of course, that's just one example, and I'm not trying to compare the two lifts, but that's an example where you can kind of see where the low bar squat, in terms of that specific variable, would have the edge. And then the last one, this is one that kind of gets overlooked, is it done by jacked natural lifters? Not by jacked lifters, by jacked natural lifters. Because with the PEDs, you can get super blurry, and there's a lot of smart guys on PEDs. There's a lot of guys that do train properly, that do train just as good, if not better, than the top natural guys out there, but a lot of guys take PEDs as a replacement for being able to train hard and properly, so that kind of blurs the lines with everything. So let's dive into these 10 points in the actual rank that I have. So number one, the least important of these 10 variables that I have listed is the total muscle group stimulated. This is somewhere where you can, I don't want to say cut corners in a program, but this is somewhere where you can just refine your program ever so slightly. So for me personally, an example on this would be like a moderate to wide, high-ish stance leg press, where quads are kind of like a moderate to lower priority for myself. My adductors and my glutes, I don't really care that much about them, but I don't want to just let them shrink by only doing like a low, narrow stance leg press and then leg extensions. So what I'll do is I'll pick a leg press which is quad biased, but I'll go a little bit higher with my stance and a little bit wider, and this allows me to get a little bit of indirect glute, well, a lot of glute stimulus, but a good amount of indirect adductor stimulus. And basically what that allows me to do is just not have to dedicate any time or energy or part of my program to like an actual adduction movement, or same with like a glute biased movement or like glute isolation or something. So that's kind of an area where you can cut corners a little bit. Same goes for like forearm training, where forearms are kind of a lower priority, that just doing back movements and bicep movements kind of allows you to at least maintain them, if not grow them slowly, depending on your training age. So there's little ways where you can kind of cut corners based on, and I don't want to use the term cut corners, but I would, I guess, rather say, how can you like refine your program to sneak in the lower priority muscle groups into other work that you're already doing without sacrificing anything else? It's how can you refine in those little ways to not only just save time and energy in the short term, but also allow more slots open in your program to be able to add variety or anything else as needed. So the next one that I have is enjoyment. So number 2, this is the second least important. How much do you enjoy that specific lift? How much do you enjoy your program? This goes beyond just the lift itself. This can go a little bit farther into, how do you anticipate that session? Are you motivated to go into that session? Are you dreading that session? This not only affects how your attitude will be going into that session, but it also kind of changes like how you feel throughout the day prior to that session. So that's obviously something that's important. I think it's a little bit overrated in the natural community, maybe a little bit underrated in like the competitive bodybuilding sphere. But overall, what I would say is enjoyment is important, but there's no way it's more important than everything else, because I think a lot of serious lifters, at least people that are kind of similar to myself in the way that they view lifting, we're in it for the results, and ultimately I enjoy training for a goal, and that just chasing that goal regardless of what I have to do is more enjoyable. So when I was doing squat, bench, deadlift, 1 rep maxes, thinking that would make me the most jacked natural on the planet, I really enjoyed that process because that was what I thought would bring me to my goal physique. But now that I used to like hate on lifts like a preacher curl or something like that wasn't like a big heavy 1 rep max movement, and now that I know preacher curls are going to get me the 18-inch arms that I want, or now 19-inch arms that I want, I enjoy the preacher curl. So to me, it all kind of revolves around the goal, and I reverse engineer from there, and the enjoyment I get is how is my progress towards achieving that specific goal. Number 3 is going to be feel. So this can mean, does the lift feel good? So do you get like a nice kind of like a pump or a mind muscle connection with it? That's not going to be a game changer for me, because I think your execution and your technique overall and your setup is going to determine how potent the stimulus is that you get, and the way that it like feels sensationally in that muscle is going to be less important, but it can be a bonus if you enjoy feeling that muscle getting worked. It's not going to be a game changer, but it can make it more enjoyable for some people. And then you can also kind of factor in the other side of this, that's not only does it get a benefit from feeling good, but it gets a benefit from not necessarily hurting or feeling bad. So there's some lifts where you might get a tiny little bit of pain, like on Smith bench, sometimes I get a little bit of like AC joint soreness. It's not enough to have me stop Smith benching, but it's enough to be a little bit annoying to where sometimes I do rotate out Smith bench and kind of dread doing it on occasion. I'd say that more so comes down to just programming properly as a whole and rotating variations as needed. But if a lift really is causing you pain and not in a productive way, shouldn't have to explain that, then depending on how severe that pain is, it might be worth doing another lift instead. Number 4, is it complementary to your program? I'm excited to announce my release of my Cure to Progressive Overload Anxiety program. If you don't have Boost Camp, it is on the app Boost Camp. I'd recommend getting it. You can see my free programs as well as this premium program. You can use my code BASEMENT to sign up and support the channel. The description of this program: at one point or another, any serious lifter will develop what I refer to as progressive overload anxiety. Lifting is a solo sport, so you'll need to self-diagnose. If you find yourself cheating your technique just to add a rep or an extra 5 pounds to your lifts, or if you find yourself avoiding lifts that don't allow for frequent progression, this program is for you. The progression scheme we're using allows you to forget about progressive overload during your sessions, so you can reapply that focus to your technique and intensity, which ultimately is what drives the occurrence of progressive overload. So this is something that I try and talk about in my tier list, because if you already have something like a preacher curl that's like the S tier bicep lift, is it going to be worth it to do like a prime machine preacher curl that's like the same exact resistance profile and the same exact setup? Probably not, because you've already done that specific movement with the preacher curl. So why would you just do basically the same thing that's a tiny little bit different? You should try and get some variety, because even if you can't tangibly measure the difference in the stimulus that you're getting, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that you might be training a different function of that muscle, which of course is going to depend on the muscle. Or you could be training even a different region of that muscle, which is a little bit blurry in terms of like strict evidence, but I think just if you think about it logically, it does kind of make sense. A very simple example of this would just be like flat versus incline bench, where the incline bench is just going to give you a little bit more stimulus to the upper chest, so you're training a different region of the muscle. So if you already did flat press and kind of smoked that movement pattern, it's probably a good idea to go on to something like an incline bench variation. You could kind of say the same thing with bicep training, where if you're doing something with complete fixed supination the entire time, it might be worth doing something where you actively supinate as you curl, or you could do something where your elbow position is changed. So if you're doing a preacher and your elbows are in front of you, it might be worth doing like an incline curl, a Bayesian curl, where your elbows are behind you to train the biceps at overall different lengths, or just something with a different resistance profile, or more or less stability, more or less strictness or cheat, etc. So getting in some variety is going to be very important, and I think when it comes down to the context of your program, that's when it makes the most sense to take those things into account. So you could also make kind of the case for barbell rows. Like whether barbell rows are a good lift or not is entirely context dependent. So there's this whole debate about whether barbell rows are a good lift or not. And it's like, if you are doing a bunch of RDLs and a bunch of deadlifts, barbell rows are just straight up not a good lift for you, because you're already smoking your posterior chain. So not only are you trying to train your traps with a fatigued posterior chain, you're potentially damaging your ability to recover even further by just excessively doing a static hip hinge when you've already done a bunch of volume and frequency for your hip hinges in general, training those exact same muscle groups. And at that point, it would make sense to do something like a chest supported row to let your posterior chain recover, and not to hold you back from training your actual traps that you're trying to train from something like a barbell row. So it is very context dependent, and I think that tends to get overlooked quite a bit. I would say number 5, so we're kind of getting to that halfway point here. it's done by jacked natural lifters. If a lift is done by jacked natural lifters, I think that is a bonus. Of course, there's a lot of trial and error with big jacked guys. So if you see a big jacked guy trying something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good lift. But if you see those guys doing it regularly as part of their routine and talking about it a lot, and they kind of always seem to default to that lift, you can take little hints from watching actual big jacked natty guys train. And this can also be said for the other way around, where if there's a lift that like none of them ever do, then yeah, it's probably good evidence that it's not that good of a lift. Maybe for reasons you don't understand, maybe it's for reasons they don't understand either, and maybe people just can't articulate it, or maybe the concept of why it might not be a good lift isn't understood as a whole. So I think experiencing and just observing firsthand evidence can be very useful, because there's some things that you just aren't aware of. There's some things that the entire lifting community isn't aware of yet, but that doesn't mean we can't take those things into account, and that's where we just have to kind of like almost trust our instincts and trust what we're seeing in a way. So like even some of like the old school bodybuilders, like they had no idea that like intensity or high frequency, like they had no idea why that worked, but they knew it worked. And we can kind of take the same thing now. You can kind of take that same idea and just say, well, maybe there's a concept or a reason why this works that we're just not sure why of. And that is just enough of a reason in itself to make it valuable. So number 6 is technicality and room for technique deviation. So with this, what I'm mostly talking about is, one, how difficult is that lift to learn? I'm not somebody that likes to write off a really good lift because there's a learning curve to it. I think there are a lot of examples of where those lifts might be better to be avoided, where you can just kind of get someone in and hit the ground running on a lift that's low technicality. But it's how much room do you have for your technique to deviate? Because if somebody is an overall like newer or less proficient lifter, they're going to have much less control over the movement that they're doing. So if you take a beginner and try and have them do pull-ups, or even like an intermediate that's like maybe a little bit weaker in the back, but they're a little bit like heavier and more bulked up, like they're going to have a hard time targeting their lats and pull-ups because their traps are going to try and take over. They're going to try and round and use the elbow flexors and just like kind of squirm their way up to that bar. And I'm not trying to say pull-ups aren't a good lift, but that's an example where there are going to be options that are more stable and easier to learn that would just straight up get you better results in the short term, that could make pull-ups a more viable option in the long term. Because all that person needs to do, they don't need to learn how to do pull-ups for the sake of doing pull-ups. They need to add some mass and some strength to their lats, and that's for something like, unpopular opinion, but maybe like an iliac pull down or a single arm pull down on like a machine or something would make a little bit more sense, because you're more locked in and it's more stable and it's a little bit more direct overall. You have more room to adjust your grip and pick the grip that you want to as well. So the overall technicality or the room for deviation of lift is something that I do like to take into account. It's not to say that you just only have to do the easiest lifts known to man, but I think when you're taking in like your program as a whole, you shouldn't just stick to lifts or completely override your program with lifts that are like hardcore technical, like difficult lifts, because they might not get you results as quick as you want to. So sometimes it's better to rely on something that is kind of an easier learning curve to just build you the muscle and the strength quickly. And then once you're like kind of jacked, it's pretty easy to learn any lift you want there. You'll notice any advanced lifter has a much easier time learning a new lift than a beginner or intermediate. So I do think that's an important factor to take into account. So now we're getting to the top 4, and this is where it gets a little bit more, it's very interchangeable within the top few spots. I'd really say within the top 5, so technicality, we're at the 6 out of the 10. That's a very important one. But I would say once we get to like these 7, 8, 9, 10, these final few points, these are going to be very important, and this is exactly what goes through my mind when I'm picking lifts. I not only for myself, but also clients. I train a bunch of people, and I've trained a bunch of people that are all trying to build as much muscle as they possibly can. And based on my years of training other people and training myself, this is what I found to work best. So the resistance profile / the strength curve, this is what's going to be at point number 7. And some people might say this is ranked a little bit too high, but I think when you're taking just your ability to put high effort into a lift comes down to a degree to the resistance profile and the strength curve. I think when you have a lift that is very strict and very short biased, it gets tricky to apply max effort because one, I would argue it's better to kind of smooth out that strength curve so you get more tension at longer lengths. So if you're doing something like a barbell row, I wouldn't just want you to kind of bend over and just do it super strict like this because it's going to be exponentially harder at the top and you're getting no tension at the bottom. Basically, like these short biased movements, in my opinion, it does depend on the lift, so there is more nuance to it. You're basically just limiting you're limiting the weight that you're using, and by that I mean you're limiting your ability to be challenged at 90% of the range of motion for like the entire mid and lengthened position by how strong you are in the short position, rather how weak you are in the short position. So I don't have a problem with short bias lifts in general, but I think when you when you're looking at putting as much mass on a frame as you possibly can, you don't want to rely on like stricter short biased movements, whether it's short biased because of the resistance profile of the lift or the internal strength curve. So having a lengthened bias lift, not only is it likely much better for building mass as a whole, training your muscle closer to its stretched position or generally at a longer length, not only is that like a common theme that you see across any fundamental lift for hypertrophy, when it comes to just not only like an effort standpoint, but also a standardization standpoint, it gives your lift a clear start and end point. So when you're doing a preacher curl, there's a clear lockout at the bottom and there's a clear lockout at the top. If you're doing something like a cable curl or even a different muscle group like a lateral raise, you don't know when to stop counting your reps. Like, is it when you can cheat a little bit? Is it when you get right to the top? What about right here? Like, does this count as a rep? And this drives a lot of people crazy. So I think one, having the standardization of your rep count makes a lot of sense. Two, I think having peak tension at longer lengths when one, you're going to get more of a stretch. Two, the muscle is generally going to grow better. And this is a theme we see across the vast majority of like time-tested lifts for hypertrophy. I think those are both very important. And I think three, when it just comes to your effort, having a descending resistance profile it makes it so much easier. Like when you're trying to grind through a barbell row, you're more prone to cheat than if you're grinding through, say, chest-supported T-bar row, where when you're stronger, the weight is heavier. And then as you pull up and your muscles get weaker, the weight lightens to compensate because obviously of how the moment arm works with that specific lift on the lever. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think just psychologically it's very satisfying to be able to lock out your reps and to be able to track it in a very standardized way. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Number 8, progression potential. And what I mean by this isn't, oh, if it's a barbell, you can add weight to it and you can add it in 5-pound increments. Like, name me something that you can't add 5-pound increments to over time, aside from like only body weight or band stuff. Like any go-to lift for hypertrophy, whether it's dumbbells, barbell, Smith machine, plate loaded machine, selectorized machine, cable, like you can incrementally load any of those lifts. So when it comes to progressive overload potential, I don't mean is it a barbell curl, and a barbell curl automatically means it has better progressive overload potential because it's a barbell and you magically can progressively overload those. Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But what I would say for progressive overload potential is how much does the lift change over time? So if you're talking about a barbell bench press, this is an example of a lift that has good progressive overload potential. Not because of the strength potential of that lift and because of just the generally big numbers that you are able to put up on that lift, but it's because the lift doesn't really change over time. Of course, yeah, the weight's gonna like push you back into the bench a little bit harder as you go heavier. It might change as your chest gets bigger or as you gain body fat or if you change your setup and whatnot. But if you keep your setup and your technique the same, the lift is more or less the same over time. And if you were to take something like a barbell curl, this is the example I always use. I know most of you guys are probably sick of hearing this. If you're an 175-pound person and you're curling a 40-pound bar, when you're at peak resistance, your 175-pound self will be able to kind of counterbalance that 40-pound bar that's a forearm's distance in front of you. But if you're 175 pounds and you're curling 135 pounds, that 135 pounds is going to pull you forwards a lot. And you're going to have to either pull your elbows back, pull your torso back, and you're going to have to cheat more and more as you get stronger on that lift, just because it's not very stable. So for a lift like that, especially as you get stronger, when you're looking at progressive overload potential, you just want lifts that you can pick your technique and progress on that without having to worry about the weight that you're using or the lack of stability changing your technique over time. So something like a preacher curl would make sense because the pad acts as your counterbalance and it acts as your stability. So for that lift, you can preacher curl all you want, but your stability will never be a limiting factor because your technique will be the same whether you're lifting 25 pounds or 125 pounds. And for my point number 9, as you guys can probably tell in the audio difference, I'm doing a voiceover now, and as I'm editing this video, while I do think point number 9 is going to be important, I also think that it's not applicable enough to enough lifts or in enough cases to where it warrants a ranking that is this high. So when I was making the list, I was thinking a little bit too narrow in terms of my overall exercise selection with this point. I want to have something that is a little bit more broadly applicable. So the point that I was talking about here was your ability to cheat on a lift when needed or keep it strict as needed, and basically your overall control over your ability to cheat or keep the lift strict. So I'm not going to waste too much time talking about it, but what I want to do is leave that as kind of like a bonus one that can apply to certain circumstances, like overall your rows or back training, or a machine that might be locking you in too strictly to a specific resistance profile, when a little bit of cheat might be a little bit more beneficial than what the machine allows for example. So the point that I do want to sub in here, and keep in mind I do want to keep this down a couple notches lower, is going to be, does the lift offer a stretch? And I do think that is more of a bonus point than it would be like a mandatory. It's certainly not a top 2 criteria for me. So where I would put this, if I had to kind of rank it among the rest of my list, I would put it between number 3, feel, and then number 4, is it complementary to your program? So this is something that is potentially beneficial. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a thing up to a certain point, and then it doesn't become as big of a factor. It's definitely not big enough of a deal to override more important things like the resistance profile if it's done by jack natural lifters. What's the progression potential and your ability to keep your technique the same? What's the technicality of the lift? And then I'll save, obviously, number 10 for when I get to that point. But hopefully that all makes sense. And yeah, I am putting stretch in here, but keep in mind it will be a few notches lower between 3 and 4. The last one that I have, number 10, the most important, is going to be stability, because that is going to take so many different things into account. It's going to take into account your the control over the strictness that you have. It's going to take into account progression potential entirely. That's the most important factor of progression potential. The stability can change the resistance profile or the strength curve, so that's obviously a very important one too. Completely changes the technicality or your room for technique deviation, which is also huge. The stability definitely puts it can take feel, enjoyment, total muscle group stimulated in not necessarily a good way into account. So stability is just kind of like the all-encompassing number 1 most important factor for picking a lift for hypertrophy. So if a lift is highly stable, you're able to train it with maximum effort. And that is why stability is so important, because a highly stable lift is like a hydraulic press. No tension leaks. All you have to do is focus on pushing as hard as you possibly can, as long as you're set up properly. And stability is going to be a spectrum too. So there are going to be some lifts that are completely unstable. So you could take like a Bosu ball squat, which is a ridiculous example, but that's an example of a lift that's not very stable, because one, what you're standing on, the actual opposing force, is like half of a yoga ball, and obviously that is not very stable. 2, it's a barbell on your back or body weight or whatever. You're not locked in, you have a bunch of joints exposed, so it's not very stable. So maybe you go to the next level up. Maybe you do like a front rack dumbbell squat. Obviously with that, it's kind of stable because now your opposing force, aka the ground, is flat, so instantly improves the stability a ton. But you holding the dumbbells up there, that's not very stable, and the progression potential isn't very good because as those dumbbells get huge, they're one, awkward to hold, and two, you kind of lose space on your shoulders to hold those dumbbells. So let's say number 3, you go up to a front squat, and that's kind of the next step of increasing stability. Cool. So now the weight's out to the side, you got the barbell up kind of by your clavicles on your shoulders. That is a pretty stable lift. Your hips and your knees and your back, those aren't going to be supported at all, but at least you have a much easier thing to hold. The problem with this is as you go heavier, it becomes less stable because you have to fight to keep that bar up there even more. So the next step up of a stable lift is going to be a back squat, whether it's a low bar or a high bar squat. This you can kind of infinitely load. You can hold as much weight on your back as probably 1.5 times what you could even squat for a single rep. So that's never going to be an issue. Your opposing force, the ground, also flat. So what's the issue with this lift? Well, this is where the stability is passable. The stability is good enough, in my opinion, but it's not optimized. So the problem with the barbell squat is your hips and your knees are free to move. So unless you are someone that is very much so disciplined and very much so in tune with their body, and arguably you kind of have to be an experienced lifter to do like a quad bias squat if you're naturally a hip dominant person. It's very tricky to maintain quad bias technique and take your quads to failure when your hips are right there and they have the freedom to shoot back and it include bigger, stronger muscle groups to get that bar up and move the weight from point A to point B. So it is stable. I'm not saying a squat isn't stable, but it's not perfect. So the next step up from there, a Smith squat. So with a Smith squat, you can use the stability of the Smith machine to kind of lean in or out of, and you can kind of add a little bit of stability to that overall movement because you're locked in on a specific movement pattern. And while you still have no back or hip support, the bar is stable and you can use that to your advantage. And then the next step up, finally, the most, I guess, overall strict and stable squat pattern you could do, I would argue there's a bunch of different machines, but I would say the strictest one or the most stable one is going to be a hack squat. Of course, you can kind of say it's a similar concept for something like a leg press, squat press, whatever. Those are just going to change the angle of your back. But say machines in general, let's say a hack squat, just for the sake of keeping this example simple, your hips are now locked in. So you can try and cheat all you want, but you're not strong enough to break that hip pad and let your hips take over. So you are forced to keep your knees forwards and keep it as a quad bias squat. The only things you have to worry about are going to be 1, your effort, 2, your range of motion, and 3, your tempo. All you have to do is push as hard as you possibly can and get good range of motion, generally under control. That's a very stable lift, and that allows you to recruit as many muscle fibers as you possibly can in the target muscle without worrying about anything else. No room for deviation, no room for a lack of technical skill to take over and allow bigger, stronger muscle groups to take over that lift. It's just, overall, stability is going to be very important for those reasons. It's maximum motor unit recruitment, basically guaranteed as long as your effort is very high. So with that being said, that's all I've got for the list. Let me know what you agree on and what you disagree on. I do want to clarify that my second to last point doesn't necessarily apply as a whole to everything, so you can rank that lower if you prefer. That's fine by me. That one is kind of a tricky one to rank in a list because there's another debate to have on how applicable something is and whether that changes the ranking of it. But either way, that's my list. Let me know what you think, and I'd love to hear in the comments what are your top 10 most important variables for picking a lift for hypertrophy. I'll see you guys in the next one.